I want to welcome everybody to our program today. Today is actually a special program because we've had so many people who are members of Amherst Neighbors or who live in the Pioneer Valley that are authors that we've decided to have a local authors series. And we do have actually somebody else in our audience, Audrey, who was a local author who gave a little presentation. But today is our first official local authors series, and we're pleased to have Dixie Brown with us. And she will be introducing herself in a few minutes and talking about her book. But before she begins, what I'd like to do is just let everybody know that the programs committee is going to be having a number of programs next month that you might be interested in. You can go to our website and find out about them. And kind of most importantly, on November 12th, we're having a gala fundraiser to celebrate Amherst Neighbors and to raise money. It's going to be at the Red Barn. Information will be coming out how to purchase tickets for this. And we are having food catered by the Black Sheep Deli. And we are pleased to announce that we're having an internationally known singer do a performance for us with his band. His name is Bill Shantz, and many of you may know of him through your kids or grandkids. And he was part of the singing group called Rosenshantz, and he did many children's songs, many albums for children. He's traveled all over the world, and since his partner passed away, he's now working on his own as Bill Shantz, and he does sing-alongs, and he goes to independent living senior communities. He goes to nursing homes, and he does performances to bring back nostalgia for eras and music that we are familiar with. So he will be doing a performance on Sunday, November 12th with Food by the Black Sheep. And when you get your information via email about our gala, please feel free to join us. I think it will be a fun celebration of Amherst Neighbors. We're now up to 560 members. We have a full range of opportunities for people to become involved in. We're looking for new board members. We're looking for committee members. And I'm just very proud to be a member of Amherst Neighbors and do quality programs like the one we're having today. The format will be that Dixie will be giving a talk. She'll introduce herself. She'll be giving a talk about the background of her book, how she came about writing the book. She'll do reading some excerpts. And then when she's done, which should be about 45 minutes or so, we'll have questions and answers. So if you have any questions, write them down. And then when she's finished, we will have a little session. Dixie has done many talks in our valley, and we're just pleased to have her here today. So Dixie, you want to take over?
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming this afternoon. Can everybody hear me clearly?
Mm-hmm.
Good. I'd like, first of all, to thank Sandy Roth and Amherst Neighbors for asking me to speak, and thank Julia Walter, who's doing tech support today and keeping me from going off the rails tech-wise. I'm just going to read what it says about the author at the back of my book, because I didn't realize I was going to have to introduce myself. So here, Sarah Dixwell Brown taught writing at Stanford University, Santa Clara University, Mount Holyoke College, and the Commonwealth Honors College at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She has published numerous personal essays in national and local publications. This is her first book. It was prompted by her receiving a family heirloom, a key to Dover Castle that once belonged to her direct ancestor, John Dixwell, a regicide of Charles I, who escaped to New England in the 1660s. And as you can see, I live in Amherst, along with most of you. So I'll get started. Historians of the English civil wars of the 1640s and the trial and execution of Charles I, which occurred in January of 1649, have long taken a great interest in the beautiful farming community of Hadley, just to the west of Amherst, on the banks of the wide and beautiful Connecticut River, Why? Doesn't it seem odd? When, on that cold day in London, Charles's head was severed from his body with one well-aimed blow of the hooded executioner's axe, Hadley didn't even exist. Not for 10 more years would Hadley be settled in 1659. All throughout that decade, England had no king. First, it was a republic. Then, for several years, it was basically ruled by Oliver Cromwell and his protectorate, a standing army, and a parliament struggling to agree on how to govern. But by the time Hadley was incorporated in 1661, Cromwell had died, his son had lacked his charisma, everything had fallen apart, and the king's son, Charles II, had been called back from his long exile in France and been restored to the throne. By the way, my website was hacked all day long on the day Charles III was crowned. Interesting. Yeah. Let me return to my question. Why is 17th century Hadley of such interest to historians of that period? Well, it's because 3 of the men who served as judges of the king, there were originally something like 120 of them, but only 59 took the fateful step of signing the death warrant, wound up hiding in Hadley for a number of years, right on Route 9. They were hidden in the home of Hadley's first minister, the Reverend John Russell. The part of Route 9 that runs through Hadley, by the way, is called Russell Street in his honor. But now let's play a little tribute to Amherst, since it's our town. Amherst, back in the years that regicides were being hidden, at great risk to everyone who kept the secret of their whereabouts. You could be killed for aiding and abetting a regicide. Amherst was actually part of Hadley. Amherst wasn't its own incorporated town until 1759, nearly 100 years after our story. So I say Amherst gets to share fully in Hadley's fame as the community that stood up to a king's desire to avenge his father. All 3 of the regicides who came to New England were never caught and died of natural causes. Back in London, a number of regicides were drawn and quartered in gruesome public executions. But the story of the ones who came to these shores, Edward Whaley, William Goff, and my ancestor, John Dixwell, has fascinated people for hundreds of years. It has morphed into legends that continue to morph into further untruths as the years go by. Particularly after the American Revolution, the story of the Angel of Hadley made its way into novels, operas, and short stories by the likes of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Sir Walter Scott. The Angel of Hadley is a story, some of which may be true, about how the regicide William Goff, brandishing a sword, emerged from his hiding place in the minister's house during a Native American attack on a church service, organized the men, and drove off the attackers. How much is truth? How much is fiction? It goes on being debated. What is certainly true, though, is that the regicides Whaley and Goff, major players in Oliver Cromwell's protectorate during the 11 years that England had no king, really were here in Hadley for quite a few years. We also know for a fact that my 7th great-grandfather, John Dixwell, joined them in Hadley for at least 6 weeks in the winter of 1665. It was more than 100 years before the United States was born. All the English settlers were British subjects, but enough of them were willing to be disloyal to King Charles II to keep the presence of the regicides in their midst a secret. But I want to start off my talk about John Dixwell with the strange fact that I didn't know he existed until I was 28 years old. It is strange because he was part of something huge. As you already know, he was one of the 59 judges of Charles I, who found him guilty of betraying his people and sentenced him to death. So I think my shock on learning about him and my puzzlement and almost resentment that my father had given me Dixwell as a middle name, it was his grandmother's maiden name, but chosen to say nothing about him, had the eventual effect of lighting a fire under me. It lit such a fire that I spent decades digging up every possible fact about him and ended up writing an entire book, not only about John Dixwell, but about my quest to learn his story. Here's how I did find out about John Dixwell. I was a grad student. It was 1980, and I was in London for 3 months. It was wonderful. And I was doing research in the British Museum. And I had been told that I was getting my master's from Stanford, that they really didn't care if I wrote a master's thesis or not. So they said, you don't have to write that paper. And I thought, oh, yes, I will. I was being all conscientious. And then one day I thought, no, I won't. Why would I? This is so much more fun just to be in this fabulous library. So I started looking up family names. And lo and behold, there was a book about someone named John Dixwell, which is a super unusual surname, who had helped get a king killed. And I was just completely horrified. It really made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I thought, I must not. Surely I'm not related to this guy. But, back then, no internet, nobody made transatlantic phone calls. So it wasn't until I got home that I could ask my father if there was a connection between John Dixwell and us. And this is the story of that day in Milton, Massachusetts, the town where I was born in Eastern Mass. This is me. Dad, I found a book in the British Museum about someone named John Dixwell. I said, he was a king killer. We're not, are we? My father hung his head. There was yeah, he said under his breath. There was a weird pause. Then he mumbled, actually, we're direct descendants. An electrical sensation went through my nervous system, followed immediately by bafflement. If Dad was this uncomfortable with the guy, why did he and my mother name me, the youngest of their 4 children, Sarah Dixwell Brown, linking me for life to John Dixwell? But I couldn't bring myself to ask, and now, so many years after his death, I can't. The reason could be trivial. It may not have crossed his mind when I joined the family that he was naming me after a man still considered a traitor and a murderer by staunch royalists in England. He was probably too busy thinking about bones. He was an orthopedic surgeon to even remember that the original Dixwell to arrive on North American shores was a wanted man. Still, it was clear he was caught off guard and bothered. Was it shame he was experiencing in that first admission of our direct descent, or guilt, as if we were still responsible for the decapitation of a king? I had felt both in my first encounter with John Dixwell in the reading room. I wish I knew what Dad thought about Dixwell's actions, but how strange that on the day he acknowledged our descent, he said nothing to suggest Dixwell might have done something important, even exceedingly brave, on the world stage. So 10 years went by, during which I was having babies and pretty preoccupied with other things and not doing very much about John Dixwell. An extraordinary Dixwell artifact came into my possession. Here's my description in the book of the strangely informal moment when Dad handed it over to me. I was peeling potatoes in the kitchen with my mom, and he came in and he had something in one fist. He said, "You might as well have this. Your name is Dixwell." His tone was apologetic, as if he was about to burden me. He handed me something surprisingly dense, bundled up in a plastic produce bag from the local supermarket. It was recycled, of course. My parents, who lived through the Great Depression, reused aluminum foil and string. I put down my potato peeler and took it. Who knows if I even washed my hands? "You should have it," he went on wearily. "You're the one who's found out the most about John Dixwell." I could see he felt guilty that he didn't know more himself, as if his 12-hour-a-day schedule as an editor and an orthopedist should have left him time to do genealogy. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer, just waited as I opened the bag, on which was printed in orange and brown, "The Fruit Center Marketplace, a shopping adventure," and pulled out a big, rough iron key. "Good heavens," said my mother. "It isn't every day that your father gives you a 17th century key to a castle in England." Several moments went by before I remembered to breathe. Here's an odd thing, though. You might think that its being a key to a castle would have aroused my curiosity. I might have wondered why John Dixwell had the key to a particular castle and what he did there. But it didn't occur to me to wonder, nor did Dad say anything about it. Instead, my eyes were fixed on the word on its yellowed label, the word I'd learned for the first time in the reading room of the British Museum. Regicide, I said aloud. King killer, I added, as if we needed the definition in order to grasp the severity of what our forebear had done. Dover Castle is in Kent County in the southeast of England. It's a military fortification, if you don't already know that. It overlooks the English Channel. And it still has a lighthouse built by invading Romans in 55 AD. And it sits atop the White Cliffs of Dover, whose chalk is great for digging secret tunnels and hiding places for military top brass. Winston Churchill had a little sort of situation room under Dover Castle. And I just want to say, if you last to the end of my presentation, I'm going to show you the actual original archival plastic produce bag, and I'll pull out my key and wave it around for you. So here's the profound truth. It was like the iron entering my soul to be given that key. Taking ownership of it meant for me that I'd have to tell John Dixwell's story. It felt scary and overwhelming, not the least because I was horrified and felt uncomfortable to be descended from someone who'd signed the warrant that authorized the beheading of a king. Plus, I knew very little about 17th century England and how the world got turned upside down in the years leading up to the formal execution of Charles I in front of one of his own palaces. So I'm just going to read you a little summary of what led up to the trial, because you may know all about it, but I sure didn't. After Charles became king in 1625, his largely Protestant subjects began to worry about his French Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, and the royal couple's love of fun. Puritans wrote pamphlets denouncing the lavish musical theatricals staged for the king, his queen, and nobles. They were appalled when he reissued in 1633 the Book of Sports, which authorized various forms of recreation on Sundays, which Puritans just thought that was terrible. A Protestant lawyer, William Prynne, published a criticism of the Queen dancing and called female actors whores. He was sentenced to life in prison and had his ears cut off. I recently listened to a British podcast that said his ears were cut off twice, actually. I don't know how you could even do that, but apparently his ears were cut off twice. Nevertheless, numerous sects of Protestantism proliferated. The more radical of its members, determined to root out what they saw as idolatry verging on Catholicism, smashed stained glass windows and destroyed priceless art, both in cathedrals and in the homes of royalists. But the turbulence did not shake Charles's belief that he ruled by divine rights. As king, he was second only to God in the great chain of being, ordained by God since time immemorial, with everything from angels to earthworms to minerals in appointed places. Charles thought absolute power over his subjects was not only his right, but his duty. To subdue resistance to his increasingly tyrannical policies, he instigated not one, but 2 civil wars against his own people. To fund the wars, he levied various capricious taxes that drained the country's resources. The loss of life was probably higher than that of the First World War in terms of percentages of the population. Unpaid troops plundered freely. Impoverished citizens were required to house soldiers from both sides of the conflict. Wounded war veterans begged in the street. The weather was terrible. Crops failed. So, but still, even in the beginning of my search to learn about John Dixwell, despite all my dismay, I started feeling defensive of him. In the 1908 edition of the British Dictionary of National Biography, The writer of Dixwell's entry is withering in a way that made my hackles rise. And the contempt continues. I felt aggrieved just the other day when I was reading the British historian Adrian Tinniswood's he wrote a 2013 book about the Rainborough family. He has this to say about John Dixwell. John Dixwell, who had been undistinguished until he signed the king's death warrant, remained undistinguished. Gosh. In fairness, Tinniswood has a point. John Dixwell was a small fish compared, say, to Edward Whaley and William Gough. During the 11 years that England had no monarchy, Whaley and Gough served Oliver Cromwell as major generals. They were so close to Cromwell, they were at his deathbed. Dixwell was a mere colonel. He was down in Kent a fair amount of those 11 years, not in London. He wasn't fond of Cromwell. Nevertheless, he was part of something world-changing and profound, and I eventually concluded was very brave to choose to serve as a judge of his king and live forever after with the enormous consequences of his decision. I spent decades researching and writing and rewriting the book. I didn't know for the longest time that the New Haven Museum has all the letters John Dixwell received in exile, as well as legal documents he drafted himself. Nor did I know that they'd been given to the museum in 1889 by my great-great-grandfather, Epps Sergeant Dixwell. At that point, when he gave them, they've been passed down through many generations of Dixwell descendants for 200 years. And now I'm going to start the slideshow, show you Epps Sergeant Dixwell. So this is Epps Sergeant Dixwell, my great-great-grandfather. And here's an example of the kind of things that they have that Epps donated in 1889. This is John Dixwell's actual handwriting, and that's a bit of sealing wax because it's a legal document that's stamped with his ring or his whatever he had to stamp hot sealing wax with, and it's the same stamp that's on the death warrant for Charles I, which is owned by Parliament in London. It's just sort of amazing to think. I wonder if somebody in this country has that seal. I bet somebody does, and they're just not saying. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey to find out all I could about John Dixwell's childhood, his education, what may have radicalized him, and his flight from justice in 1660. Although I had been an English major with no formal training in history, I soon became obsessed with the idea of primary materials. No doubt I was inspired by owning a fantastic piece of concrete evidence, the key to Dover Castle, but I wanted more. I suspected I might have to go to England to find whatever records of John Dixwell's life still existed, but that was a daunting prospect. And of course, there was another thing. My writing group, who had been suffering with my many drafts of the manuscript for too many years to count, began insisting that I take the key back to Dover Castle and try it in the lock. Then, and this was the coup de grace, Mi Jung Kim, who's in that picture. She was my student, a private ESL student, and when I said that I was scared to go to England, she said, "Why don't I go with you?" And I was kind of horrified because it's like, now I had to go because Mi Jung really wanted to go, and she was a fabulous traveling companion, and she's a huge part of the middle section of the book. And we're still best friends, although she had to move to California. I was sad about that. But once I had her as a traveling companion, before we left, I started emailing complete strangers in England, professors, librarians, archivists, and every one of them was incredibly kind and helpful. And many of them agreed to meet with me and teach me what I needed to know in order to understand my 7 great-grandfather and show me whatever they had in their collections. Somehow I was able to schedule them all into 2 weeks in May. Mi Jung and I got on a plane and arrived in London. So the place where we stayed, it doesn't exist anymore. It went out of business during the pandemic, but it's the Penn Club after William Penn of Pennsylvania. It was a wonderful Quaker boarding house. It was wonderful. It was just around the corner from all the places where John Dixwell had spent time. We went to Lincoln's Inn, which is a sort of a fancy club for lawyers where John Dixwell studied the law. And it's still where the very, very fancy barristers have their chambers. They have QC written after the names, meaning Queen's Counsel, only now it's KC, King's Counsel. There was I went in and I wandered all around and I could see these wooden things saying who was inside. It was these incredibly famous lawyers. KC, I must say now. And then the Royal Courts of Justice are just on the same street as Lincoln's Inn. I love those hinges for the Royal Courts of Justice. They're just so beautiful, super old. And then the next day we went down to the Houses of Parliament, and that is Cromwell. They didn't put up that statue until the 19th century in Victorian times. Before that, they right after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, they dug up his dead body and they took his head and put it on a pike outside Parliament, where it was there for 25 years. So they were pretty mad at Cromwell. This is the Whitehall, the banquet hall, not far from Parliament, and Charles I was beheaded right near that leftmost window right here. And this is a plaque and, a little bas-relief statue of him. I mean, a little bust of him. And it says on that, His Majesty King Charles I passed through this hall and out of a window nearly over this tablet to the scaffold in Whitehall, where he was beheaded on 30 January, 1649. It's just chilling, I've got to tell you, reading that. Then I went to the far north of England because I wanted to see if it was true that all the birth years that were given in every single article about John Dixwell, which was 1607, I think really he was born in 1613. And I was able to see his father was a vicar at this church from 1602. It's the most beautiful church. There's his father. See that right? There's Edward Dixwell. So he was the vicar until 1616 when he died, leaving his wife Mary with 6 little children, all 10 and under. A major disaster. So then John Dixwell ended up with his older brother Mark, living with their rich bachelor uncle Basil Dixwell, who had so much money he built this enormous pile of bricks called Broome Park. And because even though neither of them was the firstborn son, if you know about primogeniture, with primogeniture, the firstborn son gets everything, and none of the other sons gets anything. So that's why Mark was, he adopted 2 of the 6 kids, Mark and John. And so Mark was going to inherit all of Basil's money, and Dixwell had to go to law school, basically, to earn his own living. But what happened, that's the interior of the Great Hall inside that pile of bricks. Wait, I'm going too fast. So what happened was Mark Dixwell, his older brother, got killed in a battle in the First Civil War. And I think that was one of the things that really radicalized John Dixwell. So I did take the key back to Dover Castle, and that's my key right here. These are the ceremonial keys that the constable is still given. A constable of Dover Castle is a military position, serves for life, and lives in a special apartment at Dover Castle where John Dixwell lived as well during the time he was governor. So my key is dwarfed, but you can see it from a similar time period. They authenticated my key. This is the governor's apartment where John Dixwell lived in 1659 and 1660. and that it was constructed in 1220. It's just, I couldn't, that's on the other side, that balcony was built in the 1640s. So John Dixwell would have stood on that. And from that balcony, you look over the English Channel towards France. So beautiful. This is the church near that big pile of bricks in Barham. And this is where Basil Dixwell is buried and Mark Dixwell is buried. And John Dixwell is not buried because he became a fugitive from justice after Charles II was restored to the throne. So this is John Dixwell's grave behind Center Church on the New Haven Green. And this is his first tombstone. And it just has his initials and his death date and his age, because he thought that British soldiers would desecrate the grave if they knew who he was. So it just says JD, but they figured it out and they did desecrate it during the Revolutionary War, of course. And then after the Revolutionary War, later generations of Dixwells built a really fancy grave with, you can see that's the same coat of arms that's on the red sealing wax. That's me tracing out the coat of arms in my little notebook in 1980 with 3 fleur-de-lis. This is a house in Hadley that I imagine is like the house where the regicides were hidden by the Reverend John Russell. And this is the fields all around Broome Park in Kent. It was just unbelievably beautiful. And these are the fields of Hadley, Massachusetts, also unbelievably beautiful. This is a beautiful sheep in England and a beautiful calf in Hadley. This is in John Dixwell's handwriting, the record of his first child's birth. And it says, I don't know if I can read it because your faces are covering it up, but on the 9th day of June, being the second day of the week, my daughter Marie was born about a quarter of an hour before 9 in the morning in the year 1679. And I like to think that he was so tired from being awake all night listening to his wife Bathsheba being in labor that there's all these blobs and sort of shaky, messy handwriting. Because what a big deal to become a father for the first time in your late 60s. His wife was 35 years younger than he was. But I'm going to, towards the end of the slideshow, I just like to show all the things that refer to the regicides that are right near us. So this is right near Chili's and Stop and Shop on Route 9. Indian land called Norwottuck, settled in 1650 by families from Hartford. The regicides, Generals Goff and Whaley, were concealed for 15 years in the pastor's house. And then if you continue down Route 9, go past Dunkin' Donuts in Hadley, you'll get to Whaley Street, which intersects with Russell Street. And then after that, you get to Goff Street. So next time you're driving to Northampton, see if you can notice that. And then not far from Juvenile, oh no, so this is the tabletop graves of the Reverend John Russell and his wife. And they've been so weathered by acid rain that some wonderful person in the 20th century copied out the words, and so that you can read it. The Reverend Russell remains, who first, it says, the flock of Christ in Hadley till the chief shepherd suddenly but mercifully called him off to receive his reward in the 66th year of his age, December 10th, 1692. And this is another marker on Route 9. Perhaps you recognize it as kind of across the street from Esalen. I put this on Twitter because I have a Twitter account now that I have a book, and this got 10,000 impressions in a week. I don't know why people are so interested in Whaley and Goff across the pond in England. They're kind of obsessed with them. They're not at all interested in Dixwell, but they're super interested in Whaley and Goff. This is a painting owned by the Forbes Library in Northampton of the Angel of Hadley. You see, this is meant to be William Goff with his sword. marshaling people. All the women are terrified. There's the minister, terrified, and there's the Native Americans about to come in and do who knows what. So that's a pretty famous painting. It's by Frederick Chapman. So New Haven celebrates the regicides too, and its streets celebrate not just Whaley and Gough, but even Dixwell. So that's right in the middle of Yale University, this intersection with Whaley, Gough, and Dixwell. They have cigar boxes with the Judge's Cave. That's a cave where Whaley and Gough hid and were fed by Native Americans before they wound up in Hadley. So there's even an old seedy motel called the Three Judges Motel in New Haven. I mean, it's a really big part of the sort of culture. This is the back of the church. You can see John Dixwell's grave over here. And then it also celebrates other major actors in that time period. Let's see. So this is Theophilus Eaton, was the first governor of the New Haven colony, which was separate from the Connecticut colony. So all these things were erected in the 1930s. I'm not sure why, but it says, Eaton, so famed, so wise, so just, the phoenix of our world here hides his dust. This name, forget New England never must. It's pretty weird construction of that sentence. And then just behind are tablets, that's still Theophilus Eaton, but this is a tablet honoring Edward Whaley. And this is one honoring, oh, that's a close-up. And this is honoring William Gough. Wait, not ready. So I wrote the Center Church. I emailed the church historian. I said, how come you have these things on the back of, and they were, what's really interesting about them is they were workers, WPA project during the Great Depression under FDR. They hired these marvelous artists, Salvatore Milici and Peter Santos Saldivar, and they started working on them in 1934, and they were dedicated in 1935, and they're really, really beautiful. So let's see, but so this is Bathsheba's grave. She's in Middletown, Connecticut. She outlived her husband, John Dixwell, by 40 years. She never remarried. She had 2 surviving children. They had 3, but the third one died when she was 2. So let me see. I want to read this though. The New Haven Museum has the entire one-sided correspondence of Dixwell's years in the New World, where he was the only regicide to marry, because Whaley and Gough already had wives and children back in England whom they never saw again. It also has all the indentures he wrote in his efforts to get back money and land in England. He never gave up hope that he'd be able to return to England and raise his family there. But instead, he died of congestive heart failure, just as it might have become safe for him to return after the Glorious Revolution in 1689. The museum also has a silver snuff box that my great-great-grandfather, F. Sergeant Dixwell, gave to the museum. But I had an expert, silver expert at Yale analyze it, and she said, no way, that's not. It's an 18th century piece of silver, not 17th century. So I'm guessing it was made by John Dixwell's son, who became a silversmith. Since the book's publication, more exciting things have happened. In John Dixwell's will, he gives his sword to his son John, who became a noted silversmith in Boston. So maybe he was the maker of that snuff box. But I just found out that a second cousin has what he was told is Dixwell's sword. I've never seen it, but they sent me a photograph. It's really long, and the scabbard is, falling apart. But I asked a historian in England, and he said it looked like a gentleman's sword worn for dress occasions, not for a war. So I wonder what they're going to do with that sword. I hope they can get a museum to take it. A distant Dixwell cousin who lives in Cheyenne, Wyoming, heard about the book and emailed me and is now contacting Dixwell cousins in California, Rhode Island, Georgia, and Colorado. Maybe they have Dixwell things, like the seal with which he stamped his coat of arms into red sealing wax on the death warrant, and onto the indentures that he penned in New Haven, or the books he gave to his daughter Mary, or the tweezers he gave to his son John. I like to think of more and more Dixwells everywhere reading my book, learning what I discovered about our common ancestor, and then embarking on their own quests. So it's almost time to stop, but first, let me return to my wonderful time in England, which was in 2014, as I was researching for my book. Often I walked through Tavistock Square in London, where I visited Gandhi and thanked him for finding a non-violent way to gain independence, almost exactly 300 years after the regicide of Charles I. Then I would stroll over to Virginia Woolf. I had abandoned the Bloomsbury group that long ago day in the reading room of the British Museum in 1980, but because of that, I had discovered Dixwell. What, to use her term, a moment of being that was. Woolf's To the Lighthouse is among my favorite novels, and she got the idea for it. I gotta get this person to go away. She got the idea for it in Tavistock Square, and so she wrote about that. One day, walking around Tavistock Square, I made up, as I sometimes make up my books, To the Lighthouse in a great involuntary rush. No such luck for me. Who knew it would take 40 years for my book to come into being? But I don't regret any of it. My last slide is a picture of the last John Dixwell in my branch of the family. He died in 1931, childless. Today, although many people have Dixwell as a middle or first name, as far as I know, there is no one on the planet with the surname of Dixwell. I'm grateful I was able to tell the story of the first Dixwell to come to the New World, fleeing for his life. I don't want that story to disappear as it disappeared in my branch of the family ever again. So thank you. That's the end.
Okay, so we have, a few minutes, we have about 10 or 15 minutes. If people would like to ask questions. I do have one to start off. Is that when your father had the key, am I right? It was about 400 years old.
Yes,
How was it that he had that key after all those years?
because somebody in each generation, I said I would show it to you. Someone in each generation passed it down before they died. Thank goodness. But if I hadn't, this is the key. And I have a big picture of the key that my press made so you can really see. Those are the labels that were on it. And this careless librarian was handling that and broke it right off the key. I was so mad at him. I was like, what? You broke the 19th century label. That's my Ep Sergeant Dixwell's handwriting. Dover Castle, ESD for Ep Sergeant Dixwell. John Dixwell, Regicide, in command. That's what he wrote. He knew a lot. And it's interesting because some people in the family were super interested, but my father just was not. And I just think so amazing to choose a produce bag to put an ancient, incredibly important key. So that's where I keep it still. But I put it in a Korean box out of respect for the wonderful Mijang. That's Korean, mother of pearl inlay. So
But
yeah.
it's
So
astonishing that,
if you read get a chance to read my book, Sandy, I mean, I talk in the afterword about who must have had the key in each generation
okay.
between John Dixwell and me, because it has to have been them, because otherwise it would have gone to some other branch of the family. But it came to me.
Wow. That's an amazing story.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll call on you. John, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. I don't actually have a question. I just want to. This book was wonderful. I loved listening to it. And what I loved best about it was the story that was told like a mystery in your own voice. It was so intriguing along the way, and like the surprise of when you found things. It was lovely, and the detail that, well, like you said today, you were handed the key while you were peeling potatoes. Was that what it was? Those kind of details were all throughout the book. But what I wanted to acknowledge the most was I've been by those streets, Gough Street, and all that, and those monuments hundreds of times, and I've never seen them. And now when I go by, they mean something to me. It feels really important that, I love the town we live in, and it just adds a lot of meaning to just being here, that I have that awareness of where that name came from. So thank you for that, Dixie.
Thank you, John. That's really nice to hear.
So I think John is referring to the Audible book. Is that correct?
Yes. Oh, right. Yeah. There's an
Yeah, so-
audiobook which I narrated, which John has actually listened to wonderfully. You
Yeah.
can get it from audible.com
Yeah.
for less than buying the book at Levelers. Yes. I see somebody raising his hand.
Paul?
Hi, I really enjoyed this talk. Thank you so much. I haven't read your book yet, but I did read An Act of Oblivion. I
Yes.
don't think there's a single reference to Dixwell in that book.
I think he is in there.
Oh, is he?
Not very much.
So did you say he did come to Hadley? He did hit.
Yeah, that's our first record of him is William Gough had a diary that got destroyed during the Revolutionary War, which is so sad because it just, he kept a journal. And so we don't have it anymore. But he noted in his journal the day that John Dixwell arrived in February of 1665. We don't know how long he stayed.
I see. And then he hid out in New Haven afterwards.
Yes. No, he lived openly. That was what was amazing. He changed his identity.
Oh.
He changed his name to James Davids. And he married twice. And the first wife died within the first month. So I was in my book, I freak out. I think, oh my God, he murdered his first wife for the money,
Did he really?
But I asked a history professor, he said, no way. If somebody asked you to look after their wife because they were dying, that meant you were supposed to take care of the wife. And she was old. She just died. Maybe she married him because she was dying so that he would get the estate because they didn't have kids, which was great because he completely run out of money at that point, So it gave him barely enough money. They got pretty poor by the end of his life. It was hard. More.
Wendy?
Yeah.
That brings up another interesting point. How did he feed his family, live after he came over?
Well, what's fascinating about the letters, it's a one-sided correspondence. We don't have any of his letters because if you were caught receiving a letter from Regicide, you would be killed. So probably all his letters that went to England were immediately destroyed. But he had one person only in his family who remained loyal, which was his niece. And so we know from her letters that she sent him money, like she sent him 50 pounds. We know that when he was fleeing, before he was pretty clever, like before he fled, he sold a property that he had and he got something like, I don't know, 12,000 pounds. So and he went first to Germany for about 5 years. So he lived in Germany, I think, because he was thinking he could go back to England as soon as things settled. But instead, the people that he was living with got caught and drawn and quartered. And I think at that point, that was when he got on a boat and sailed to the New World, which I'm sure was not his first choice. And I think at that point, his funds started dwindling because there's no way to earn money. But he got 800 pounds when his first wife died, and he got her house and land. I mean, it wasn't like, Broome Park had something like 5,000 acres, and he probably had maybe 15 acres of land in New Haven. A pretty huge lifestyle change. New Haven was a real backwater back then. Like anything interesting to eat had to come by boat from Boston because New Haven had almost nothing.
Significantly reduced circumstances.
Significantly reduced. And he got quite anxious. We do have an indenture he wrote trying to get the land in England for his children. And he said, I would have perished of want because of my terrible relatives. I mean, he really gets angry in this indenture. He just lets them have it. It's really dramatic. But that the Lord hath provided for me. If the Lord hadn't provided for me, I should have perished of want. And then how ungrateful, because when his brother was killed in the First Civil War, he left 5 little orphan children. Well, his wife was still alive, but so John was fully responsible for those 5 children for 18 years. He did everything for them, and only one of them was loyal to him after he fled. It's kind of understandable. It was pretty dangerous to be connected with a regicide.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We still have a little time, right?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
It seemed like what you said, being a regicide, even though he was in this country, even though he was in Hadley, it was still considered dangerous to be a regicide.
Well, because Charles II sent over what were called his commissioners.
Oh,
The job was to find them. So there's all these stories about how Whaley and Goff were hiding under a bridge, and the commissioners were cantering on their horses above the bridge, and they were underneath, and then they were hiding in a cave. Remember the cigar box I showed you? That's the cave is called the Judge's Cave, where they were hidden for months and months. They ferried around. They were in a number of different towns in Connecticut before they wound up in Hadley. And we don't know where their bodies are. We only know where Dixwell's body is. And one sort of cool thing that I put this in my book, in the 19th century, his descendants got a lot of money in a pretty slimy way with selling opium in China during the Opium Wars. Not a very nice thing to do. The Americans and the British were doing it, and it was legal for them to do it, but it was illegal. The Chinese they had a huge problem with addiction, and they were just furious, and hence the Opium Wars. But 2 Dixwell brothers, that great-great-grandfather who wrote the note on the key, it was his 2 brothers. He was a school teacher, but his 2 brothers were were merchants, and they made just scads of money. And so they decided they wanted to make a really fancy grave for John Dixwell, because all through the 18th century, you might want to pretend that you didn't know the man and you weren't related because we still belonged to England. But after the Revolutionary War, all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're proud. We want everyone to know. So they built this amazing grave that's still there that I showed you. But they decided they wanted to dig up Dixwell's bones to see if he really was down there. So there's this amazing newspaper article about how they did it in the early dawn so they wouldn't get caught for grave robbing. And then they took his skull, which is still intact 200 years later, and put a newspaper, the New Haven newspaper, over the top of the skull, carried it across the green to a phrenologist. Does everybody know what phrenologists do? They feel bumps on people's heads, and then they decide that they're inferior or superior in intelligence based on the bumps. So the phrenologist said he definitely had the skull of a violent man. And then they put him back in the grave, and all his toe bones were still intact, and his leg bones. And they buried him again, and they put up that really fancy obelisk, on which it has 4 sides, and so it tells the whole story as they understood it. It's very boastful, true patriot, all that stuff. I mean, you might feel that the regicide was a terrible thing, of course. A lot of people do.
okay. Any further questions? We have like 1 or 2 more minutes. If not, I want to thank you, Dixie, so much for sharing your book and the reading and all your information. It was just fascinating. And as someone said, I've been up and down that Route 9 1,000 times. I never saw the monuments. I've been down, was it Gough Street and the other street? Been down those streets taking a shortcut to avoid the traffic light there, and I will now look at it differently.
And I didn't know about them either. I didn't notice them for the first 20 years I lived here, believe me.
Well, thank you very much, and thank everybody for coming.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody. Take care.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Julia.